Hey guys, welcome back. Today's video is all about the camera basics. So basically, what is shutter speed, what is an aperture, what is ISO, and the different shooting modes. The program mode, aperture priority, shutter priority, and manual modes. So if you're a beginner and you got your first digital SLR, this video is for you. So let's get started. First, I'm going to start with the three basic camera settings: the shutter speed, the aperture, and the ISO. So ISO is basically the sensitivity of the camera sensor. Lower the ISO, lower the camera is sensitive to light. Higher the ISO, higher the camera is sensitive to light. So this is basically a sensor parameter. So in bright light, you can shoot with lower ISO, but in low light situation, you need to shoot at higher ISO. The only problem is that when you increase the ISO, camera sensor is getting more sensitive and there is a chance of increasing image noise. Image noise is basically that tiny grainy stuff that you see in your image. So when you are increasing the ISO, the images get more grainy. The next is the aperture. Aperture is basically the opening inside your lens. So it is determined by a value called f number. So lower the f number, higher the opening, and more light the lens is going to let in. Higher the f number, smaller the opening, and less light the lens is going to let in. The f number also determines the depth of field of your image. Lower the f number, more the background blur. Higher the f number, all of the elements will be in focus, which is less background blur. The next parameter is the shutter speed. Shutter speed is how long your sensor should be exposed to light. Lower the shutter speed, longer the sensor will be exposed to light. Higher the shutter speed, lesser the sensor will be exposed to light. So if you want to freeze a moving object, you need to have a higher shutter speed. If you want motion blur, you need a lower shutter speed. So enough talking, let's get into the shooting. I'm in program mode right now, as you can see by the P symbol here. And below that, I have something called an exposure compensation. And here I have the ISO control. So the good thing about program mode is that when you're in program mode, you can control the exposure compensation, which means how bright your image is, and you can also control your camera's sensitivity, which is the ISO parameter. You can also control the white balance and a lot of other stuff. But now we are going to concentrate on how to shoot in program mode by using the exposure compensation and the ISO. So first, I'm going to set the ISO to auto, which means that the camera is going to determine the ISO sensitivity, and since we are in the program mode, the camera is going to decide the shutter speed and the aperture as well. So let's take a look at our subject. So I have focused at this particular lens in here, and the camera is telling us that the shutter speed is 1/60th of a second, aperture of 2.2, and at ISO 100 I'm getting the camera's light meter is telling the shot is going to be properly exposed. So let's take a picture right now. If I want to increase or decrease the brightness of this particular image, what you can do is you can press the AV button in here and press and hold it, and you can turn the command dial down to make your image under bright, and you can turn this towards the right to make it more brighter. So that is basically we are underexposing or overexposing the image, as you can see by the histogram over here. So first I'm going to take the same picture, underexpose it by one stop. As you can see, I can underexpose by 3 stops and overexpose by 3 stops. That is minus and plus. And I'm going to take a picture. Now you can see the values. 60 is the shutter speed, 2.8 is the aperture, and ISO 200. Now I'm going to take another picture. I'm going to overexpose it by 1 stop. Oh, see, the shutter speed is now same, 60, and the aperture value is 2, and the ISO has gone up by 400. So let's take a picture. So now we have 3 images. So this one is the overexposed one, and underexposed, and the proper exposed. So in program mode, you can control how bright your image is with the help of exposure compensation. And you can also control the ISO parameter. Now we have set it to auto, which means that the camera is going to decide everything. Now I'm going to change the ISO to 100 and let's shoot another image. I'm going back to live view. Now we'll try to meter see. Now the shutter speed, the camera is telling us the shutter speed is 1/50th of a second and the aperture value is 1.8 at ISO 100 to get a proper exposure. So let's take a picture. So in general, program mode basically means you can control the ISO and you can also control the exposure compensation. The shutter speed and the aperture is determined by the camera itself. Now I'm going to go to aperture priority. In aperture priority value or AV, we can control the aperture and the ISO, and you can also control the exposure compensation. So let's see. What I'm going to do is I'm going to set the aperture to the lowest possible of this lens. So it's the 1.8 is the lowest possible aperture value of this lens. Now I'm going to focus on this particular subject, and now see, the camera is telling us our ISO was set to 100. The camera is telling us at 50th of a second and our aperture of 1.8 we are getting the proper exposure. So let's take a shot. Now look at that image. Our aperture value was 1.8. So that is why our subject is properly in focus and the other elements are actually out of focus. So this is what we call as the depth of field. Now we are getting a shallow depth of field. Our subject is perfectly in focus and it stands out. All other elements are actually blurry or it's out of focus. Now I'm going to do one thing. I'm going back to the live view and I'm going to choose an aperture value of f8. Now we'll take the same shot and see how it looks like. See, at f8, this is our shutter speed. It is very low. Why? Because we have increased the aperture to f8. That is, we are letting in less light into the sensor. So the camera set a low shutter speed right now. Now take a look at the image. See, we have our main subject and the Nikon camera behind it. That too is little more in focus when compared to our first image. See, in this image, all the elements in the background is blurry and our subject, which is a Canon lens, it's sharp. Increase the aperture value to f16. So we are letting in very less light into the camera sensor. At ISO 100 at f16, when we meter, the camera is telling a shutter speed of 1.6 seconds. So let's take a photo. As you can see, all of the elements are in focus. From the foreground to the background is in focus. The next I'm going to demo is the time value or shutter priority. So first I'm going to set the ISO to 100 and the shutter speed to 1/25th of a second. I'll go back to the live view and let's take a picture. See, it's blurry. So at 1/25th of a second, the camera decided the aperture as 4.5 and you can see it's blurry. So if you want to make your subject move like it's moving, you can reduce the shutter speed and make it blurry so we feel that it's moving. Now, what if you want to freeze the subject? So let's go back to the live view. I'm going to increase the shutter speed to 200th of a second. So when we meter, when I half press the shutter button, at 200th of a second, the camera is setting the aperture to 1.8 at ISO 100. So let's take a picture. Let's see. See, at 200th of a second, we freeze the moving subject. So higher the shutter speed, you can freeze the action. Lower the shutter speed, you make an impression of movement. So our subject appears blurry. See the difference? We have a freezed subject which was actually moving, and now we can feel the motion blur. So lower the shutter speed, more blurrier your moving subject will be. Higher the shutter speed, the more you are going to freeze the subject. So if you're taking action photos, you can use the shutter priority to freeze or make a motion blur of your subject. So what exactly is happening when we increase or decrease the shutter speed? If I'm going to set the shutter speed of 1 second, what it means is that the sensor is going to be exposed for 1 second. If I'm going to set the shutter speed to 1/100th of a second or 1/60th of a second, which means that the sensor is going to be exposed for that particular duration. Next, we are going to move into manual mode. So what is manual mode? As you can see, we control the shutter speed, we control the aperture, and we control the ISO. So all these three main parameters are controlled by us. Now let's see how we can use manual mode to get a proper exposure. I currently have set the ISO to 100 and the shutter speed to 1/30th of a second and aperture to 1.8. So when I half press the shutter button, the camera is telling, see the light meter, the camera is telling us we are slightly overexposed. So I can increase the shutter speed to 1/40th of a second and the camera's light meter is telling that we are properly exposed. So if I am increasing the shutter speed at 1/80th of a second, we are underexposed by 1 stop. So if I am reducing the shutter speed to 20th of a second, we are overexposing by 1 stop. The same happens with the aperture also. So I'm going to increase the aperture right now. See, at 2.5, we are actually underexposing the image. At 1.8, we get a proper image. The same happens with ISO also. I'm going to increase the ISO to 400. When I half press the shutter button, see, we are overexposing the image by 2 stops. All these three parameters are related. I'm going to set the ISO back to 100. At ISO 100, 1/40th of a second, aperture 1.8, the camera is telling us we are getting a proper exposure. So let's take a picture. What if I want the background and the foreground in focus? What do? We can increase the aperture value. I'm going to increase the aperture value to f8. So at f8, at an ISO value of 100, at 1/40th of a second shutter speed, the image is underexposed. So if I am reducing the shutter speed to half a second, we are getting a proper exposed image. Or you can increase the ISO. I'm going to increase the ISO to 800 and I'm going to increase the shutter speed to 50th of a second. We are still underexposed. I'm going to reduce the shutter speed to 1/15th of a second. Now the camera is telling us we are getting a proper exposure. So let's take a picture. Our foreground and little bit more of the background is in focus at f8, and at f1.8 our main subject is completely in focus and the elements beyond that are completely blurred. So in program mode, we can control the ISO and we can underexpose or overexpose our image using the exposure compensation. In TV mode or shutter priority, we control the shutter speed, the ISO and the exposure compensation. In AV mode, that is the aperture priority mode, we are controlling the aperture value, the ISO and exposure compensation. In manual mode, we are controlling the shutter speed, the aperture and the ISO, and we are using the camera's light meter to determine how underexposed or overexposed our image is. That's it guys. Thank you so much for watching. If you like this video, hit the like button and subscribe for more videos like this. See you again.